Welcome to our discussion. I'm Christine Henderson, a Senior Fellow at Liberty Fund, and it's my pleasure to host today's panel on natural law with our three distinguished guests. I'd like to take a moment and introduce each of you, beginning on my left with David Armitage, who is Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University, where he teaches intellectual history and international history. David is the author or editor of numerous articles and books, and David edited Liberty Fund's edition of The Free Sea by Hugo Groceus. Next, I'd like to introduce Aaron Garrett, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Boston University. Aaron's research interests include 18th century philosophy, the history of ethics, and the history of political thought. In addition to many other books and articles, Aaron has edited two Liberty Fund works in the Natural Law and Enlightenment Classic series, John Millar's The Origin of the Distinction of Ranks, and Francis Hutcheson's An Essay on the Nature and Conduct of the Passions and Affections. Finally, I'd like to introduce Richard Tuck, who's a professor of government at Harvard University. A leading scholar of the history of political thought and international law, Richard has published widely on topics including political authority, human rights, natural law, and toleration. Richard has edited Liberty Fund's three-volume tome, The Rights of War and Peace by Hugo Groceus. Thank you so much for joining me today, gentlemen. I'd like to begin with a discussion, a general discussion of natural law, and I was hoping that each of you could define natural law for the beginning student who's interested in this field of study.
So shall I start? Okay.
Sure.
Well, I think the first thing to say, particularly about the text that we're going to be talking about today, is that people thought that there was a distinction between an older way of talking about natural law, which goes back actually well into the ancient world, and what they called a modern school of natural law. So I think the first thing to ask is what was distinctive about the particular way in which our heroes talked about natural law. And I think I would approach it in the following way, that by the 16th century, most people in Europe are very conscious of the huge variety of moral and other philosophical opinions out there. And they're very conscious of the fact there seems to be radical disagreement about all sorts of things. But they began to think that it may be that underlying this radical disagreement are certain common beliefs. That they aren't going to be very extensive, but it may be that as you travel around the world, as you see the Aztecs, the Chinese, the Catholics, the Protestants, all these groups are at one another's throat, you may find they have certain things they agree on. And they start to use the language of natural law here to mean the things which underpin all kinds of social life and which are not civil, they're not local, they're not parochial, they're not limited to particular communities. And I think that's the way they start using this old language and placing it in the context of what one might call a kind of post-skeptical sense, or a sense that's informed by the skepticism of the 16th century about how very radical moral and other kinds of disagreement are. So that's the way I would approach this, but I don't know whether Aaron and David would think the same.
I think I would just add to what Richard says that if I were explaining this to a student, I would say that natural law is two things. It's a set of norms that can be derived deductively, often by reason, from nature, from human nature on the one hand, and it's also the tradition of discussing those norms, a historical tradition, one which changes quite radically and has some very significant breaks in it. So we might associate one version of natural law with the Stoics, another with Aquinas, but then the most important one, the modern tradition, which underpins the Natural Law and Enlightenment series, is very much a post-Reformation, post-European discovery of the New World, post-skeptical tradition of natural law, which undergoes very rapid development in its conception of what the bundle of norms that can be recovered through reason deductively, which are natural to all human beings prior to any kind of civil or positive law, before the state, before any of the institutions which humans erect, what those norms are, how they fit together, change very radically and very rapidly in the period after Hugo Grotius' pivotal intervention, which I think will be central to a lot of our discussion this afternoon.
Yeah, I would totally agree, and it becomes interconnected with the new science in lots of interesting ways. A really good example is Richard Cumberland, who is one of the authors in the Natural Law series, who tries to conceive of natural law in terms of almost geometrically deducible physical laws that guide our conduct, and he really has a model of emerging new science when he's trying to think about moral laws. So there's an interplay back and forth throughout the early modern natural law tradition between issues having to do with skepticism, issues having to do with the emergence of science and how to reconceptualize morals. And the one last thing I would add is it's also becomes an institutional tradition. So it becomes a tradition of a series of books that are commented upon in academic settings, and then the commentary upon these books becomes the practice of philosophy. So a good example of this is, again, something else in the series, Gershom Carmichael's commentary on Pufendorf. He publishes that as an independent philosophical work, and his notes, influenced by Barbarac, present Pufendorf, but also dialogue with him in a way that furthers the tradition. And Hutcheson takes over his notes and teaches through them, etc. So you have this long-standing institutional tradition clustered around a few books, viewed as what one does as a philosopher.
Thanks. And so we see the sort of emergence of a particular tradition of modern natural law thinking. And the Liberty Fund Natural Law and Enlightenment Classic series really encompasses about 43 titles by 19 different authors, and it spans almost a 3-century period from about 1540 to about 1840. And I was wondering what additional thoughts each of you might want to share about the significance of this particular period. You've touched on some of the things that are going on at that time, but I'm wondering if there's something more that you could add.
Well, I'd like to pick up on something that David said about European, what we used to be called European expansion, the discovery of the rest of the world. Because it's a notable fact about many of these works, and particularly the central ones, which I take to be Grotius's Rights of War and Peace and Pufendorf's Law of Nature and Nations, which hasn't yet appeared in this series, but is going to. And of course, they have often been regarded in the past as textbooks on international law. That's how they were classified in the late 19th century, and people on the whole didn't read them very closely. But it's a very important fact about these central works that they are to do, at least in part, with the relationship between states. And something about the international arena is both treated as a model for the relationship between somewhat isolated individuals, but it also has significance in its own right. So the questions of the laws of war, questions of ambassadors, diplomacy, all that, turn out to be very central to this tradition. And I think it's a really marked feature of the most important works in this series.
And along those lines, many of the central features of these works are about the rights and duties of persons, but what a person means can either mean a natural person or an international person, and one can see many transferences of many of the same structures. An interpersonal state of nature becomes an international state of nature, or as Richard argued in some of his work, in fact, the arrow runs in the other direction, that it's reflecting upon the international realm, which powers greater and more detailed reflection on the relations between individual persons as sovereign, bounded, interactive with each other, but also bound by and controlled by certain norms and duties as well, that the natural law tradition in that sense proliferates in different directions in considering those relations between persons, because the idea of persons themselves is under very rapid change in exactly this long period that these texts treat.
And in the case of persons, one interesting thing that happens towards the end of the period is the expansion of what counts as a person conceived of in natural law, the natural law vocabulary. So you see Hutcheson in the System of Moral Philosophy, which has not yet appeared in the series but will, trying to talk about our duties and rights to animals, and trying to find a way to talk about what seems obvious to him, that we have certain moral obligations to animals within this framework. And similarly, you see in Scots law attempts to use natural law to argue for why, when slave ships come into Scots territory, the slaves should be freed. And some of the most important cases in the early period of the rise of abolition involved finding ways to apply natural law theory to extant Scot law in a way to argue for abolition. And women as well, in the case of Mary Wollstonecraft and many others.
That's fascinating. Can each of you perhaps say a few words about the continued relevance of these works to us today?
Well, I think I would say that the continued relevance arises from what I said earlier, which is that they're very interested in what's left when you've stripped away much of what is conventional or parochial or local, and the extent to which you can still find some sort of ground for negotiating with people who are culturally very different from you. And again, it's not an empty academic exercise that these people are engaged in. I mean, Grotius, for example, though he never went there, was heavily involved in Dutch negotiations, setting up a trading station in what is in effect now Singapore. I mean, he was dealing with the local ruler. And the question was, what grounds do we have for literally negotiating with, living with, people whose general cultural presuppositions, their religion, much of their ethical beliefs and so on, they're not at all ours. And that's pretty clearly the most relevant question you could be asking in the modern world. The answers we give may be different, though I think in some ways we can still use some of their answers about certain very minimal requirements upon us not to harm other people and so on. But they certainly thought it had an intensely practical purpose in a world which is very like ours in some of its salient respects.
Though it might be dangerous to follow that too far, insofar as many of the prescripts of these natural law thinkers are extraordinarily aggressive in their implications as well. Sure. If we're thinking of, say, a universalism or a cosmopolitanism of peace, these are not the obvious places to be looking at.
Though it should be said that we get many of the interesting arguments that we have already internal to the tradition. I mean, Pufendorf v. Grotius, for example, is very much an argument over the degree to which you can intervene in someone else's country if you think they're breaking moral principles, something we talk about a great deal today. Grotius says yes, Pufendorf says definitely no. You know, people are entitled to eat tourists if they wish. Because after the you shouldn't intervene on those sort of grounds. So.
Aaron, anything?
I guess I tend to be very historicist about these things, so I tend to think that, I mean, I agree with what Richard said, but I tend to agree more with David on this point, that a lot of the things they said are very, very foreign to us. And I think one of the things that's exciting about reading the tradition is seeing how things that we come to take as platitudes about moral treatment and about basic and minimal rights coexist with things that we find quite horrifying. Mm-hmm. And then asking ourselves, why do those coexist for a 17th or 18th century author, and yet why do they seem so evidently separate for us? So for me, it's a very as a philosopher, it's a very instructive experience in challenging my intuitions about what's right and wrong by seeing other people presenting their intuitions which seem wholly evident to them about what is right and wrong.
No, that must be right. I mean, slavery, which you mentioned earlier, is a good example because on the whole, although there are some exceptions later in the tradition, many of these writers are finding reasons to justify slavery. Though in curiously, so to speak, liberal or individualist grounds, not on the whole racist grounds, but they still think that slavery can be justified. So.
Yeah, so there's that kind of fascinating timelessness and then time-boundedness, if you will, between the two that I would think is productive to explore.
It takes the philosopher to remind us historians to be historicist about it.
Within the Natural Law and Enlightenment series, there's some figures who are better known and some who are less well known. I'd like to start, though, with one of the better known figures, who's Francis Hutcheson, who is a sort of pivotal figure because he was a link between the continental European natural law tradition and the emerging Enlightenment in Ireland and Scotland. And so I want to ask you, Aaron, particularly, if you can tell us a little bit about Hutcheson, about him as a scholar, as a thinker, as a man, and also about the book that you edited in particular.
Hutcheson is a central figure for the Scottish Enlightenment. And part of the reason I mean, he's a central figure for many reasons for the Scottish Enlightenment. Well, one reason he's such a central figure is he tries to draw together two strands of thought that are very hard, if not impossible, to draw together. And that's one thing that I think is very exciting about this tradition as well, is you see a lot of contention, fracture, disagreement in it. I mean, it's often presented as if it's an Irenic tradition, but it's not at all the more you look, as the Pufendorf-Grotius debate makes clear. In Hutcheson's case, what he tries to fuse together is Shaftesbury-influenced virtue theories. Shaftesbury's not in the Natural Law and Classics, but it's a wonderful edition, is published by the Liberty Fund. Shaftesbury-influenced virtue theories that stress our immediate response to virtues as evident, and the natural law picture which he taught as part of his professorship of moral philosophy at Glasgow. And in different ways he tries to fuse them together, and sometimes it's disastrous. When he tries to make sense of external right, for example, on a virtue theoretic account. It's just really hard to do it there. But sometimes it's incredibly productive. He finds ways, for example, talking about slavery. He makes a strong distinction between slavery and servitude. And he argues that servitude can be legitimate, but he has a very, very powerful critique of slavery. And this, again, this has to do with his opinions about virtue and benevolence and the way we benevolently should relate to all human beings. And that division ends up to be very productive later on with Anthony Benezet, the important abolitionist, who quotes Hutcheson extensively in his abolitionist tracts on these sorts of issues. So one of the things I find most interesting about Hutcheson, as I said, is he tries to unite two traditions that are very hard to unite, but a lot of what's productive about him, qua natural lawyer, is the heroic attempt to unite them and often the failure to. The particular work, the illustrations on the moral sense and the essay on the passions, I think is one of the most important works of moral philosophy of the early 18th century. For two reasons. One is, in it, Hutcheson provides his most powerful attack on what's called moral rationalism and provides a theory of moral motivation that becomes enormously influential through Hume, Smith, and many other philosophers. And in fact, philosophers still look to Hutcheson's account as really a defining moment for trying to think through how are we motivated to act morally, and can reasons do this without any kind of sentimental motivation. And the other thing I think that's so extraordinary in the work is he's not unique in this, but he tries to reconceive the passions in an almost wholly cognitive manner. So he tries to give an account of the passions as modes of mind. And why I think that's so important is, in the Scottish tradition, there's this huge stress on thinking about morals in terms of mind. The philosophy of mind is the basis of which you make sense of our moral life. And the account of the passions he gives in the essay on the passions provides a means to do this, to think about how mind, questions of understanding, bear on moral issues.
Thanks. Hugo Groceus is considered another one of the most important thinkers in the early modern period. And I wanted to ask you, David, since you edited Grotius's The Free Sea, if you could tell us a little bit about Grotius as a thinker and about the basic premise of the title that you edited.
Mm-hmm. The title I edited is Mare Liberum, or The Free Sea, which is an early work of Hugo Groceus's. It points up the fact that Grotius was both precocious and prolific and pivotal, he's the three Ps. He's known throughout Europe in his teens as one of the leading humanists. He manipulates and writes in all of the major humanist genres, from poetry to history, and on to the major works that we have in the series, canonized now as foundations of natural law. But in the case of the Mare Liberum, he's in his early work as a hired hand, a hired gun, an advocate for the Dutch East India Company, crafting an argument in the larger work from which Mare Liberum comes for Dutch penetration of the East Indies, as Richard has already mentioned, trying to interpret the norms which can govern the relations between European and non-European peoples, obviously to the advantage of the Dutch, but in doing so, beginning to find his way to what will become some of the foundations of his theories of property and ownership and sovereignty, and also towards his theories of rights as subjective moral faculties. So in the context of doing something very practical, writing essentially a legal brief with a large historical casement in the larger work De Jure Praedae, as it's known, or the Law of Prize and Booty, and then selecting from this the particular chapter which becomes Mare Liberum. He's producing a work which I think, and my students have found, I know other students have found, to be probably the best introduction to emerging theories of property, sovereignty, and rights in the early modern period, because of Grotius's pivotal role in forming what we think of as this modern tradition of natural law, with subjective natural right very much at its heart.
Thanks. Did either of you want to add anything about that title?
Well, I think I'll say a little bit more about Grotius in general in a moment, but so if you want me, shall I say? Well, I mean, it's worth remembering that in the late 17th century, people began to think something new has happened in the way people think, and they started writing histories of it. And in fact, Pufendorf contributed to this genre, but there are lots of others. So they're sort of histories of morality. And in one of the best of them, which was written by Barbarac, the man who edited both Grotius and Pufendorf in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, he says what was important about Grotius was he was the person who broke the ice after he thought something like 2,000 years of sort of frozen thought, that no one had really been able to get away from a set of platitudes. Pufendorf described Aristotle as merely parroting the views of an Athenian gentleman, and that there's nothing. And they thought that Grotius was the first person, astonishingly enough, the first person in the history of the world, they're making very major claims about him, who could somehow extract himself from that sort of discourse. As I said, that's related to his desire to sort of simplify, to pare down the set of moral principles that we need to live by. It might sound rather extraordinary to say that he's paring them down, because his great work, The Rights of War and Peace, De Jure Belliac Parcis, which appeared in 1625, when he incidentally had been driven into exile, he was a politician in his native Netherlands who fell foul of political contests in the Netherlands. So it was actually published when he was already in exile. But it's a huge book, so it sounds odd to say that he's simplifying, and yet what he's trying to do is to take a pretty basic set of principles, roughly speaking. We're always entitled to defend ourselves, and we should never unnecessarily harm other people, and see what you can do simply by thinking through the implications of those principles. And of course, at the heart of that is something about violence. And all his major works are concerned with violence and with war. And in the case of The Rights of War and Peace, he's applying these principles largely to international war, but in the process generating a number of very striking claims. For example, and this is one of the things that astonished his contemporaries, the claim that private individuals can act like states. They can use violence against one another. And that's linked to what David was talking about. The Dutch East India Company is a private company. It's not a state, but it's actually involved in what amounts to warfare in the Far East. And one of the things Grotius wanted to think about is, can what we would call corporations, can they act like states? Can they have, warships that go out and attack the Portuguese or the Spanish? So all sorts of questions about what sorts of rights individuals can have, including rights to use violence upon them, but the limits of that violence are being explored in this book, which, as I said, is ostensibly and mostly on the basic questions of international law and war. And of course, as I've argued in a number of places, the obvious thing that comes out of that sort of discourse is going to be Thomas Hobbes, because he too is, of course, as we all know, obsessed with violence, the problem of the fact that people use violence against one another, and the limits on violence. So that I think, and again, he's associated usually with Grotius by these people who look back and say Grotius sort of began this tradition. So I think that's one of the key things to say about him, that in the eyes of contemporaries, he did something very remarkable.
Thank you. Another one of the natural law authors from the Scottish Enlightenment period was John Millar, who was a student of Adam Smith's at Glasgow and later became a distinguished professor there. Aaron, I was hoping that you could tell us a few things about the book that you edited, which is The Origin of the Distinction of Ranks.
It's a really fascinating work. It was published before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but well before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But Millar had attended Smith's lectures on jurisprudence, and as far as we know, Smith had no problem with Millar publishing the work. They were close friends, but a lot of the content of the work reflects those lectures, and it reflects what Smith's lost work on the lectures of jurisprudence might have been like a little bit. So you get a sense from it of Millar's ideas, but you also get a sense of it from Smith's jurisprudential project. And from the natural law perspective, one of the things that's really interesting about the work is it's framed around a few of the central natural law duties: husband to wife, master to servant, and father to child. And what Millar does is he tries to give a historical account of the rise and change of these duties from savage times, from the hunter-gatherer period to the present day. And he gives an argument in each case that as society progresses through stages, the form of authority in each of the duties changes and becomes tempered. And as the forms of authority change and become tempered, the utility of those in the relation to society becomes both more evident and becomes more available. So in the case of women, for example, he argues that, like Hume, that in the earliest stage of societies, as Hume says, the Muscovite thought of his wedding ring as a whip, this famous passage. But as men come to understand that women are, if not for Millar, physically equal, intellectually equal, the nature of the authority changes in the relation, and women become available to society through admiring their talents, but also later on in this tradition, not in Millar, but later on through work, in a way they weren't before, and that's for the utility in general. So it's a very sort of sophisticated internal criticism of the idea that these duties are historical and stable, and an argument that if you historicize them and you give a progressivist account of their nature, you come to learn something really fundamental about the nature of authority. I think it's a very deep work.
Fascinating. Anyone, do either of you have anything you'd like to add about that title?
Well, no, I was just going to emphasize what Aaron has just said, which is it does mark a kind of change in the approach, because although the earlier natural law writers are very interested in historical development of various kinds, as we've all been saying, in a way they're fascinated by the residue, what is left when you've cut away from the historic. And this marks the beginning of a change towards something that looks more like, if you like, the next moment in the development of ideas about morality and politics.
And then also shows us one of the very important developments of the Scottish Enlightenment itself, the creation of a science of man. If we were talking about this text maybe 20 years ago, we'd be talking about it as, anachronistically at least, as one of the foundational texts of sociology, for instance, as it's often taken to be, whereas we can now see that this historical science of man is something that grows very much out of the natural law tradition, which had stadial theory, progressivism, and empiricism, which blossoms and develops in this context. And so Millar's text is one of those classic pivotal moments from the natural law tradition into something that's recognizing the beginnings of the human sciences as we might now begin to recognize them.
Thanks. We're coming near the end of our time, and so in closing, I wanted to ask each of you to choose a title from the Natural Law series, some title that we haven't talked about today. Maybe something that has is either a favorite or that has special significance within that tradition that we haven't touched on yet. And if you could just tell us a few words about that book and why you think it's an important aspect of that series, something that you might recommend to a student or to a friend. What would you pick?
Okay, it's a very tricky question, that. I mean, I think I have two thoughts. I mean, one is of course, the series does contain a full edition of Grotius's De Jure Praedae, from which, as David said, Murray Lieberman's taken. It's a fascinating work in general, in a number of other respects, and so that's clearly something to look at. But moving away from, if you like, the area of Grotius, I think the obvious text, and we've talked about him quite a lot already, is Pufendorf. And there's a number of works by Pufendorf in the series, and the obvious one is the thing which in this series is called the Duty of Man, the Whole Duty of Man, which Pufendorf wrote as a kind of student guide to his ideas. And Pufendorf is the other really important figure in this story, who, partly because he has an enemy, namely Hobbes. Grotius is writing before Hobbes, Pufendorf is writing after Hobbes, is deeply concerned with Hobbes, thought he was in some ways a genius, but in many ways very disturbing. And much of what Pufendorf does is an attempt to preserve what he took to be the fundamental insights of Grotius and protect them from what he took to be the dangerous ways in which Hobbes had developed them. And that applies right across the board. It applies in ethics, it applies in politics. Pufendorf was determined to try and produce some defense of something like the modern liberal monarchies of Europe, which he took Hobbes, not unreasonably, to have undermined with a lot of his theories. So I think that's the work I would select as really important and telling you a great deal about how, in the eyes of one of the cleverest contributors to this tradition, the tradition could be preserved from someone who they thought worked within it and yet was seeking to destroy it, namely Hobbes.
Unlike Richard, I find that a very easy question. I think I'd have no hesitation in recommending Richard Watmore and Bela Kaposi's marvelous edition of Vattel's Law of Nations. I always tell my students that Vattel's Law of Nations is the single most important book of the late 18th and early 19th centuries that they've never heard of. And we know, for instance, that it was sitting on the desk in the Continental Congress at exactly the moment that the Declaration of Independence was being written. Benjamin Franklin had sent a copy to Congress to be used for that very purpose, that the language of freedom and independence, free and independent states that makes its way into the US Declaration, is taken very directly from one of the leitmotifs of Vattel's work, and then one can see its global spread. I think it is actually the single most important European text in global context between about 1750 and 1840. It crops up in the Greek independence movements, it crops up in the Spanish-American independence movements. One can find it being used to justify the dispossession of native peoples in both North America and Australasia. It seems to have been packed in the bags of every magistrate who moved through the circuits of the British Empire until about 1830, and so on and so forth.
Good thing people carried their bags for them.
Absolutely, and it's not as big as Pufendorf or Grotius. It's not the most original text by any means in the canon, but one can find an argument for almost anything, for anti-colonial independence on the one hand, and then for the march of colonists through what they would see as unpossessed land, and arguments for the taking of it. So I think that is the single most important text for about 80 years either side of the early 19th century in many, many contexts within and beyond Europe.
Great, thanks. Aaron?
In my period, it's no doubt Pufendorf. Pufendorf's big work and then the small work that has already appeared in the series marks a sort of way of responding to Hobbes. And for me, and I think for most people, the 17th century is really before Hobbes and after Hobbes. And the problem after Hobbes is, how do we take Hobbes into account, take what's good in the theory, but temper what we find disturbing. And Pufendorf provides the model for how you do that, really until Shaftesbury and the end of the 18th century, the rise of the kinds of theories Hutcheson is drawing on. And I don't think one can really understand 18th century moral philosophy if you haven't read Pufendorf. And fortunately, recently there's been a Pufendorf revival among moral theorists. It's coming back, and I think for good reason. If I wasn't going to pick Pufendorf or Vattel, that's very good. Yeah. I would say Hutcheson's other short work, The Inquiry Concerning Beauty and Virtue, it's the first systematic treatise on what we call aesthetics of the 18th century, and it's one of the major works that links together, in the English language, and it's one of the major works that links together questions of beauty and questions of virtue, that becomes a dominant way of thinking about it throughout the 18th and the early 19th century. And it also, with the essay on the passions and the illustrations of moral sense, gives one of the first ways of presenting what comes to be called utilitarianism. It's a huge influence on someone named John Gay, who criticizes the moral sense theory part of it and says, but I'm going to run with the utilitarianism. And that becomes very crucial from then on.
Wonderful. This concludes our discussion today, and I want to thank each of our distinguished panel members for their time and for helping us all understand more about natural law, about the Scottish Enlightenment, and about some of its key authors and themes. Thank you all.